consider this, that Afghanistan has a thousands-mile-long border with the Islamic Republic of Iran. Islamic Republic of Iran is enemy number one of the Israelis, according to Mossad, according to the Israeli Defense Force, according to Israeli successive prime ministers. So there's no way that Israel is not going to be looking at Afghanistan as a crucial player within its geopolitical game.
Para que se asustan será pa' mejor. Es el pueblo entero el que ya está gritando. ¡Viva la revolución!
Iranian nuclear weapons development.
They have turned the island into a communist hellhole.
The experiment in Venezuela has failed completely.
I wanted to talk about one entity in the Middle East that is not really spoken about whenever we're talking about Afghanistan. One entity that has benefited tremendously from endless U.S. wars and occupation in the region, that is heavily invested in wars and imperialism and financing occupation of the region, which is the quote-unquote state of Israel, which also is carrying out an occupation on Palestinian land, on occupied Palestine, and is trying to start a new war with Iran, trying to start a new war with the resistance forces in Iraq and Lebanon. And Israel isn't really mentioned whenever we're talking about Afghanistan. But what's interesting is that as I was researching and reading about those who opposed the withdrawal of US forces in Afghanistan, there were a lot of similarities in the people who were opposing the withdrawal. A lot of the commentators who were neocons or even quote unquote liberal Democrats who spoke out against Biden pulling out, a lot of them are hardcore supporters of Israel, of Zionism, of the occupation of Palestinian land. And I find that really fascinating because there are a lot of parallels there in terms of their need for endless war, their need for endless occupation of lands that belong to people who have been there for thousands of years. And so I just wanted to ask you, what are your thoughts on the so-called withdrawal and the role of Israel? How is Israel viewing all of this?
Yeah, it's a fascinating angle that you're coming at it from. Very few people want to, I think, touch this issue of Israel and its impact beyond the Middle East, because of course technically Afghanistan is really part of effectively South Asia in a way. Really, it's kind of on that border between India, Pakistan, and then of course into Iran and the Western Asia proper, if you like. So often it gets neglected as a region which might be of interest to Israel. The bottom line is this, that Israeli, Indian, American interest within Afghanistan is absolutely crucially and integrally part of the foreign policies of each one of those players. Of course, when I talk about America, I'm really talking about Anglo-Zionist empire, which includes the British and NATO and whoever else is in that cartel, if you like. That sort of imperialist cartel. So Israel, what connection might it have? Well, first of all, consider this, that Afghanistan has a thousands-mile-long border with the Islamic Republic of Iran. Islamic Republic of Iran is enemy number one of the Israelis, according to Mossad, according to the Israeli Defense Force, according to Israeli successive prime ministers. So there's no way that Israel is not going to be looking at Afghanistan as a crucial player within its geopolitical game. First of all, they needed Afghanistan in order to put pressure on Iran on its eastern borders, and they have done that. I'll go into how over the time we have. Also, of course, Israel is very concerned about one major issue in that region, and it is nuclear weapons. Pakistan has nuclear weapons. It is the only Islamic nation to have nuclear weapons. Pakistan has a huge standing army. It has a very efficient army by all accounts, and it has nuclear weapons. It's also, on paper at least, officially unrecognizing of Israel, and in fact very stoically against Israel and the Zionist state. Both nations were formed or came into being in the same year, 1947, and they've been diametrically opposed. People don't know also that Pakistani Air Force has the only pilots who've ever taken down an Israeli jet fighter or three in open dogfights and wars. They did this, I think, in the 67 war, in which Israel lost. The only fighters I believe it's ever lost in aerial battles is to Pakistan and Pakistani Air Force. So there has been a history, and there is a history of Israel keeping a very watchful eye on Pakistan.